All right, Chapter 20, Part 2, World War II. We started talking about some of the origins of World War II in the last chapter, but now we're really going to get into the meat of it. Remember when we were talking about World War I? It wasn't called World War I at the time, right? It was the Great War, or the war to end all wars. It was the greatest conflict in human history, and people cannot imagine a conflict worse than World War I. Unfortunately, World War II is going to blow it out of the water in terms of countries and geography involved, in terms of dead and wounded soldiers and civilians, in terms of physical destruction. World War II is going to be the largest conflict in human history. And unfortunately, as we will learn at the end of this chapter, after World War II, there is no return to normalcy like we kind of saw after World War I. Before World War II is even really over, we're going to launch right into the next conflict, the Cold War, which in some ways, especially looking in terms of time and maybe money spent, the Cold War is going to be even worse off than World War II. So let's get right into it. Broad themes for this chapter. We're going to talk about the origins of World War II, Asian and European aggression. We're going to talk about a very brief timeline of World War II. We're not going to go super in depth into a lot of the battles, but we're going to hit the high points of the timeline of World War II. And then, like I mentioned, this new conflict that begins really even before the dust has settled on World War II. How do we go about rebuilding the world? Well, it turns out there's going to be another conflict waiting for us, the Cold War. So we'll talk about that. So let's start with the origins of World War II. World War II, you can really trace its origins all the way back to 1931 because this is when Japan gets very aggressive in the Pacific. 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria, which you can see on the map here is a portion of northeastern China. We've actually already mentioned Manchuria. You may not remember it. Uh, Japan has had their eye on Manchuria ever since 1904, 1905. In fact, they go to war against Russia over control of Manchuria. And the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, was really Japan's kind of coming out party. They beat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and that opened a lot of people's eyes because Russia was an old, established, European empire, and of course now we know they were on the downhill side. But Japan was a tiny Asian island nation, and the fact that they were able to go toe to toe with a European empire and beat them really opened a lot of people's eyes, and people began to realize that, hey, Japan is for real. They are an up and coming world power. And in fact, after World War I, Japan is considered one of the big five powers. They become very active on the world stage. They join the League of Nations. They sign on to the Kellogg-Briand Pact. They are a leading nation of the world. The problem for Japan is, of course, that it is an island nation. And if they want to continue to grow and establish themselves and become more powerful, that they need room and natural resources in order to do that. And that's why they wanted Manchuria. They thought if they could take Manchuria, that would give them the room and resources needed to expand. So in 1931, they fabricated a reason to go to war with China. I think they made up an attack on one of their railroad lines. They blamed China for it, and so they used it as a pretext to go to war with China in 1931. Of course, if you will remember, after World War I, we designed an organization designed to prevent such actions like this, right? That was what the League of Nations was supposed to do. The League of Nations was supposed to stop countries from acting aggressively. And like I just said, Japan was a member of the League of Nations. Well, the League of Nations, of course, condemns the attack, but they couldn't do anything to stop it. And that was one of the big reasons, number one, that the League of Nations eventually falls by the wayside, and number two, that we have World War II in the first place, is that we have this international organization designed to prevent aggressive warfare, but they're not actually able to do anything to stop it. So the League of Nations told Japan, you can't do this, this is wrong. Japan just leaves the organization. They say, okay, fine, we end our membership in the League of Nations, and they go on to launch a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. Incredibly brutal, incredibly brutal. Hundreds of thousands of people die in what becomes known as the Rape of Nanking. Anywhere from 150 to 300,000 people are killed over a span of around a month and a half. You see this picture here. It's just heartbreaking. You see uh, Japanese Imperial Army soldiers and officers looking on. You see people being put into these mass graves. These people are not dead, they're being buried alive. By the end of this so-called Rape of Nanking, they weren't even bothering to kill the Chinese civilians before they buried them. Just incredibly brutal atrocities being committed by the Japanese Imperial Armor. Um, China, of course, is a large country, and at one point in history, remember we've mentioned this several times in the semester, they were the most technologically developed, place on the planet. Unfortunately for China, they were in the middle of a civil war uh, when World War II broke out, and we'll talk more about this later. A civil war between the followers of Chiang Kai-shek and the followers of Mao Zedong. And since they were already weakened from fighting the civil war amongst themselves, they were completely unable to resist the Japanese, and so they fell relatively quickly. We also see aggressive actions out of Italy. Italy is really upset about World War I. They really thought they deserved to get more out of World War I than what they did. What they really wanted was Ethiopia, which is in northern Africa. They were unable to sort of get any of the plunder or spoils after World War I, and so they invade Ethiopia on their own in 1935. Again, mass death, estimates of somewhere over 250,000 people die in the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. They also get involved in the Spanish Civil War. Remember, we mentioned when we were talking about the Great Depression, one of the side effects of the Great Depression in Europe was that Spain becomes engulfed in a civil war. And the Spanish Civil War is really kind of interesting because it's almost a preview of what's going to happen in World War II. So there are two sides in the Spanish Civil War. The Republicans, which is the legitimate government that's backed up by France and Great Britain. And then you have Francisco Franco, who is a fascist who goes to war against the legitimate, or at least more legitimate government. And Francisco Franco is going to be backed up by Italy and later Germany. And he wins. The forces supported by Italy and Germany are able to win. And so that really should have opened a lot of people's eyes as to what was coming, but it didn't. But okay, fine. We see aggression and aggressive actions all over the globe. We see Japan pushing the envelope. We see Italy pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable. But no one, of course, goes further than Germany. We've already mentioned in the last chapter, we spoke about Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The Weimar Republic was already unstable. It was doing okay in the 1920s, but then the Great Depression hits. We mentioned that the Great Depression hit Germany hardest out of all the countries of the world. It hits Germany the hardest. That's what allowed Hitler and the Nazis to take power. And again, Hitler comes to power preaching economic salvation. He doesn't necessarily stand up and say, I'm going to kill millions of people. Uh, that probably would not have been as well received, right? He tells the people, I know you're hurting. I know you need help. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you back to work. I'm going to make sure you get the food that you need. And people loved him for this. That's why he has these huge stadiums of people cheering and chanting his name, and why everyone flocks to the Nazi Party, not necessarily uh, because of the racial stuff, but because he is able to deliver on these promises of economic salvation. He is able to put people back to work. He is able to give people what they want to survive, what they need to survive. The racial stuff will come later, but of course, that's always sort of the underlying uh, motivator for Hitler and the Nazis. Even if he's not preaching it necessarily in the beginning, it certainly is his personal motivation. Hitler was, you know, the main thing with Hitler was always these ideas of race. He believed that the German race was a superior race. He believed that the Germans were a master race, and all along his claim, what he was willing to tell people, he said, "Listen, what I want to do, I want to unite all Germans under the German flag." Wherever they live in Europe, or I suppose even maybe the world, if he had really been ambitious, I want to unite all Germans under the German flag. This goes back to nationalism, right? This idea that a culturally unique people with a shared history and a shared background deserve their own political independence. That's what nationalism is. That's what Hitler's talking about. That he wants to unite all German-speaking people, all people of the German blood. You know, this idea that culture has a biological component. It's not true, but that's how they spoke. He wants to unite all people of the German blood uh, under a German flag. And then, kind of the unsaid thing is, and then we want to expand and take over everyone else. He referred to this as Lebensraum, a living space or growing space, living room. If the German race is going to take over, kind of like Japan in the Pacific, the Germans are going to need room to stretch and grow and expand. But Hitler, he's, you know, for everything he is, he's not an idiot. He knows that he is being watched very carefully, and so he knows that he needs to step very lightly. And so we're going to see a very, not necessarily slow, but maybe a gradual progression of events. It all begins in 1935. First thing he does, Germany leaves the League of Nations. And again, the League of Nations was kind of a joke anyway. But he goes ahead and he makes the formal step of leaving the League of Nations. The other thing he does, and this is one of the ways that he delivers on his promises of economic salvation, he begins an army buildup. Now, technically speaking, this was not allowed under the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that ended World War I. And under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany took a lot of the blame. And because of that, they were limited to a really small army that was only supposed to be used in self-defense. Well, one of the ways that Hitler puts people back to work, he sends them to factories to build tanks and planes and guns and soldiers' uniforms and whatever else. That's one of the ways that he delivers on his promise of putting people back to work, is he begins to build an army. Now, this is not allowed. Great Britain and France really don't like this, and so they they protest, but they're not willing to go to war over this. No one wants to fight another global conflict. They don't know what's coming, but they're really uneasy about pushing Germany hard enough to start another war, and so they protest, but they're not really willing to do anything, you know, to bring this to a fight. The next year, Germany is going to occupy the Rhineland. The Rhineland is a small section of Germany They were forced to give it up after World War One. The reason that Hitler wanted the Rhineland is because it was heavily industrialized, lots of factories. And again, he's putting people to work. He needs these factories to build tanks and planes and guns. And so even though that they were supposed to give it up after World War One, he takes it back. Again, Great Britain and France protest, but they're not willing to go to war over it, and so nothing happens. And basically, this is known as appeasement. Give Hitler what he wants, and maybe he'll stop. And he kept saying this, right? Hitler says, I need to put my people back to work. Germany needs to defend itself. Just let me build an army, and that's it. I'll be done. I'll be happy. Well, now I need these factories. Just give me these factories. I'll be done. I'll be happy. And every time he asked for these things, or every time he took these things, Great Britain and France, they went along with it and said, okay, but that's it. This is it, no more. And of course, next year, Hitler's going to do something else. But that's the idea behind appeasement. If we just give Hitler what he wants, he'll be happy, and maybe he will stop. During this time, Germany and Italy become allied with one another. Mussolini and Hitler really remember, they were both fascists. They both really kind of understood each other politically speaking. And so, okay, that's where we're at. 1938, Germany is going to annex Austria in a move known as the Anschluss. And again, this speaks to Hitler's nationalism. Austria, culturally speaking, is heavily German. And so he said, listen, I want to annex all Germans. I want to unite all German-speaking people under the German flag. I'm going to take Austria. Reactions to this were mixed. There were a lot of people in Austria who saw what Hitler was doing and really liked it. Remember that he himself was born in Austria. Um, and so, yes, he rolls in tanks, and yes, he marches in troops, and technically, I suppose it is an invasion, but there were a lot of people in Austria that welcomed the Nazis, and so it wasn't seen necessarily as that big of a deal. But now we're getting into kind of sketchy territory, because the next item on Hitler's list is an area known as the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia was a country that was formed out of World War I. One of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles was the creation of this country, Czechoslovakia. Remember, this was the whole reason of World War I began, that the Slavs wanted their own country, right? So Czechoslovakia was a country created out of the ashes of World War I. Well, there was a section of Czechoslovakia that was right next to Germany, in which a number of German-speaking people lived. It was known as the Sudetenland. And so Hitler says, listen, I've been telling you guys, I want to unite all German-speaking people under a German flag. I want the Sudetenland. The problem is that, unlike Austria, Czechoslovakia was unwilling to join Germany. And Czechoslovakia has some pretty big friends. Czechoslovakia has an alliance with France, who has an alliance with Russia. And so just like, the days leading up to World War I, we've got this system of alliances that this, relatively small country could go to war and drag everyone else with it. It looks like war is on the way, and Great Britain and France do not want that. They're trying to avoid war any way they can. And so they go to Germany and they say, listen, let's sit down, let's talk about this. And so in Munich, Germany, 1938, they all get together to talk about what we're going to do. And so from left to right here, the leaders that attended, this is Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain. This is the leader of France, whose name I can never remember. Of course, that's Adolf Hitler, and then Benito Mussolini of Italy, and then some random Italian soldier who I don't know their name. So notice that Czechoslovakia was not invited to talk about what's going to happen to Czechoslovakia. So 1938, Britain, Italy, France, and Germany meet in Munich, and they decide to continue this policy of appeasement. They tell Hitler, okay, we're going to give you what you want, but this is it, no more. And Hitler says, sure, this is all I've ever wanted, was to unite the German-speaking people. After this, I'll be happy and I'll be done. This was seen as a great accomplishment. This was seen as a great victory for Britain and France because they managed to negotiate a peaceful end to Hitler's aggression. They managed to avoid war, and in fact, Neville Chamberlain, when he returned home to London, he proudly proclaimed, "I have kept peace for our time," and he was greeted by cheering crowds. Everyone loved the fact that finally they had negotiated a peaceful end to Hitler's aggression. Except, as it turns out, of course, not so much. 1939, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, and it becomes clear that he's got his sights set on, bigger fish, right? Well, you can kind of follow the progression. Austria, then Czechoslovakia. Next in line is Poland. And so Poland is getting pretty scared at this point. You can see the way that Germany is moving. You can see that Poland is sort of next on the buffet line, right? And so Poland, another country that was formed after World War I, relatively new. I mean, the idea of Poland has been around for centuries, but this version of Poland was only created after World War I, relatively weak. And so once they see what happens to Czechoslovakia, they begin signing military alliances. They go to England, they go to France, they say, listen, we know we're next on the menu. We want you guys beside us in case Germany invades. And Great Britain and France, they agreed to come to the aid of Poland if need be, but no one really thinks that this is going to happen. Still, no one thinks that war is going to break out. And the big reason that they don't think that the war is going to break out is because of the location of the Soviet Union. I've got a map here. I don't know if my mouse will show up on the recording. But you see here, this is Germany. And this is actually Germany. Germany's like right here. They've already annexed Austria at this point. And so this area right here, this was the Sudetenland. This is Czechoslovakia. This was the Sudetenland that Germany has already annexed as well. And so right here, and as I said, next on the menu, this is Poland, and they are getting pretty nervous. Well, the reason that no one thinks that Germany is going to invade Poland is because of its next door neighbor to the east, the USSR. And I mentioned in the last chapter, but just to remind you, Hitler and Stalin hated each other. They are complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. Fascism is far right, socialism is far left. And so, even though you can maybe draw a lot of parallels between their actual actions, politically speaking, fascists and socialists hated each other, even though, of course, the Nazi Party called themselves the National Socialist Party. They hate each other. And everybody knows that if Germany invades Poland, the Soviet Union is going to see that as an act of aggression, and they are not going to sit idly by. And so, what Germany does not want is to get into a war with the Soviet Union in the east and also be fighting Great Britain and France in the west. They don't want to be fighting on both sides, right? And so, everyone is still banking on this idea we're going to keep peace. There's not going to be any problems because there's no way Germany's going to be crazy enough to invade Poland and risk a war with the Soviets. At the same time, they're fighting a war with the British and the French. So, everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be all right. Little did everyone know that Germany has signed a secret treaty with the Soviets. They've signed what's known as a non-aggression pact. This isn't a military alliance. This isn't a promise to help each other. Basically, it's just an agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union saying, listen, Germany, Germany says, if I invade Poland, don't take it as an act of aggression. I'm not going to invade you guys. I want to be sure that we keep our peace. And Stalin agrees. And in fact, they divide Poland up between them. Germany says, I'm going to invade Poland. I'll take part of it. You can take the other part, and we'll both be happy. Again, this is a secret treaty. Nobody knew that this had happened. And when this finally comes to light after World War II starts, people are just, they're shocked, they're flabbergasted that Germany and the Soviet Union managed to put aside their mutual hatred of each other enough to sign this treaty. Really takes everyone by surprise. But now that they've secured peace with the Soviet Union, that frees up Germany to invade Poland, and on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Uh, Great Britain and France automatically declare war on Germany. Germany declares war on them, and suddenly we are in the thick of World War II. This is truly a global war to a greater extent than even World War I. Basically, the entire globe will be engulfed in conflict. Asia was already at war. War is going to break out in Europe. It's going to break out in Africa. It's going to break out in the Pacific Rim. Even the United States. The United States, which had not seen any sort of battle or foreign invasion, I suppose, since the early 1800s, even the United States is going to get involved in World War II. Again, this will be the idea of total war, the idea that entire societies must be mobilized for the war effort, and probably to a greater extent than any war previous to this, civilians are going to be part of not just the war effort, but they're going to face death and destruction themselves. Now, when World War II first breaks out, there's a period of time, several months, that's known as the phony war. Because what happens is Great Britain and France declare war on Germany, Germany declares war on them, and so technically they are at war, but everyone kind of has to get ready. You've got to get all your troops together, you've got to outfit everyone with weapons, you've got to get everything lined up, you've got to get everything, troops sent to where they're supposed to go, you've got to set up supply lines and food and get them guns and tanks. So it takes a little time, even though you've declared war, to get everything sort of up and running. That's why it's known as the phony war, because even though they've declared war and technically they're at war with one another, there's no fighting going on. And this is the first great tactical mistake of the Allies, because Great Britain and France are preparing for World War I again. They think that this conflict is going to be just like World War I, and it's not. And so remember that the primary feature of World War I was trench warfare, right? It was a very slow way of fighting war. It was very methodical. It was stagnant almost. You had these lines that barely changed from week to week or even month to month. And so they're gearing up to fight this very plodding, slow moving type of war like we saw in World War I, and that is not what happens. Germany is going to use a new strategy. I don't think that the Germans actually, I don't think Hitler called it this. I think this is something that maybe military historians came up with after the fact. But this new strategy is going to be known as the Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war, going to move much quicker than World War I did. And you will see here in the background, the primary feature of the Blitzkrieg is the use of heavy armor, the use of tanks. World War II is the first true tank war in modern history. And so what would happen is the Germans would use their massed armor. They would use these giant columns of tanks to smash through an enemy's defenses and then just keep going. And then they would follow it up with soldiers later. But it moved very, very quickly, and Great Britain and France were not prepared for the speed of these new tactics. France is going to fall after really just a matter of weeks. Great Britain is going to escape at the very last second. Great Britain had been sending their troops to France to get ready for this war. They were gathering their troops in France, and then all of a sudden, the Germans are knocking on the door. Movie that came out relatively recently, Dunkirk. This is based on true events. The English were gathering in France, getting ready to go to war, and then all of a sudden the Germans were there, and the British aren't ready. And so they're trying to escape back to Great Britain. And so they're trying to get back across the English Channel. Basically, they're trying to get into anything that floats, military transport, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, whatever they could get to get troops onto. They were trying to get everyone loaded up and back across the channel. And they did. They escaped at basically the last minute, which was great for the Allies. If they had been caught in France by the Germans, it might have been a very different story. But as I said, France surrendered after just really 7 or 8 weeks. At this point, Italy joins the conflict. Um, and so by 1940, Hitler controls most of Western Europe with the exception of England. He is going to go after England in what's known as the Battle of Britain, or sometimes referred to as the Blitz. The Battle of Britain is an air battle which lasts for months and months and months. I mentioned World War II was the first tank war. It's also the first war in which air power plays a significant part. Now, the British were never able to, the Germans were never able to defeat the British. They just launched wave after wave of attacks on the British, and the British simply refused to give up. But they were on the ropes. And so they were just barely hanging on. So at this point, Hitler is going to control most of Western Europe, and even the only ones left standing, England, they're just barely hanging on. And so by this point, Hitler decides that it's time to launch the next phase of his war plan, and that is going to be an invasion of the Soviet Union. I think everyone knew, even with this non-aggression pact, it was a temporary thing, and I think probably both Hitler and Stalin had plans to double cross each other, and I think Hitler just got there first. In 1941, Germany will launch what's known as Operation Barbarossa, which was a surprise attack on the Soviet Union, even though I have to, the Soviets had to have known that this was coming. It initially goes very well for the Germans. They make huge gains, and by the December of 1941, they were within striking distance of Moscow. And if they had captured Moscow, it probably would have been all over. But Hitler does make several crucial mistakes. He underestimates the tenacity of the Soviets. I've read accounts of the Soviets during World War II. Like the British, they just refused to give up. I've read accounts of Soviet soldiers being sent to the front lines, and the Soviets had nothing. They don't have tanks, they don't have planes, they didn't even have guns that they could give their soldiers. And so they're gathering up soldiers and they're telling them, we're sending you to fight the Germans, but we can't give you anything. Just find whatever you can along the way, and that's what you're going to use. And the Soviets did it. They simply refused to give up. I know that the United States, we love to say we stepped in, we won World War I, we won World War II, and that's true to a certain extent. You can certainly make that argument. But the Soviets are the ones that are going to pay the price in World War II. They lose over 23 million people in World War II. They were the ones who honestly defeated Germany. They just would not give up. The other mistake that Hitler makes, he underestimates the size of Russia. Russia's huge. And so he becomes very stretched out. The German forces become very thinned out. And they're just not able to keep up the supply lines, to keep the goods they need, to keep the war machine going. And last but certainly not least is, of course, the Russian winter. Didn't work for Napoleon, doesn't work for Hitler. Hitler thought that they would be in and out and that Russia would fall relatively quickly. That did not happen. They got caught there in winter, one of the worst winter in decades, and the Germans just were not ready for the severity of a Russian winter. And really, that's going to be the turning point of World War II in the European theater. The Battle of Stalingrad, August of 1942, lasted somewhere between 5 and 6 months. Maybe as many as 2 million casualties, people killed and wounded during the Battle of Stalingrad. And this was the downfall of the German military machine. Even though the war will continue on for several years, they never fully recover from the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union. That was really proves to be their downfall in the long run. However, at the time, in 1941, Hitler's feeling pretty good about himself. He's got England on the ropes. He's got the Soviets on the ropes. He controls pretty much all of Europe. If he hasn't conquered them outright, they are allies of him or they're neutral. There's basically no one to stand in Hitler's way. He's conquered a huge chunk of North Africa. He's feeling pretty good about himself. And now is the time he believes that he can begin his master plan. And of course, that is racial imperialism. We're not going to go super deep into the Holocaust. But something that I've mentioned, I believe, in the last chapter, I want you guys to be aware of, it's not something that happens all at once. It is a very gradual process. It's a very incremental process that moves slowly over a number of years. And we've already spoken about part of this, I think, in the last chapter. It begins with legal discriminations. And when I say legal discriminations, I don't mean things that are right or just or okay. I mean discriminations that are rooted in laws. Germany began to pass laws against Jewish people. And so they were denied certain jobs. Jewish people weren't allowed to be doctors or lawyers or things like that. Jewish people weren't allowed to attend certain schools. They weren't allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. And then things get worse, right? All of a sudden, it becomes not only can you not live in these neighborhoods, you have to live in these neighborhoods, the so-called ghettos. Jewish people were herded up, they were removed from their homes, they were stripped of their property, and they were sent to live in these confined areas. The thing is, everyone knew that this was happening. Jewish people were not sitting idly by, right? Anyone that could leave did leave. Unfortunately, a lot of people left. If you left for Austria, or if you left for Denmark, or if you left for France, ultimately that proved to be not far enough, right? So even though a lot of German Jews left, they were later caught up as Hitler Empire began to expand, right? The other thing is that other countries realized that this was happening. And in fact, and I forget the name of it now, I should have looked it up. The Evian Lakes Conference, the Crystal Lakes Conference, something like that. There was an international conference hosted that said, listen, look at what's happening to the Jewish people in Germany. The countries of the world ought to do something about it. And everyone got together and said, oh, yeah, sure, that's horrible. We absolutely should do something about it. And then nobody did anything. Uh, when Jewish people who were trying to leave, you can't just pick up and leave to another country. The other country has to agree to accept you, right? They have to grant you a visa. When Jewish people were applying for visas in places like Britain and France and the United States knew that this was going on. They were being denied left and right. Um, and so in 1942, Hitler proposes what he calls the final solution. At the Wannsee Conference in 1942, Hitler comes up with the final solution, extermination. And I've always wondered, and I don't know, if other countries had been willing to take the Jewish people, um, would we had seen the extreme, the atrocities of the Holocaust. I don't know. I don't know. But of course, uh, no sense in rewriting history, I suppose. The Jewish people were not, the vast majority of Jewish people were not able to get out. And so Hitler does begin his plans for extermination. The Holocaust begins with special military groups known as the Einsatzgruppen, um, which were mobile death squads. What would happen was, as Germany took over an area, these special soldiers would come in. They would round up any Jewish people, and I keep saying Jewish people. The Holocaust was bigger than just Jewish people. Other targets of the Holocaust, the Roma, people with physical or mental handicaps, homosexuals were targeted by the Holocaust. So as Germany moved into an area, they would come in, anyone that they deemed inferior or undesirable, literally they would dig a mass grave and just start shooting people. That proved to be pretty rough on the soldiers. That wasn't necessarily what they had signed up for, and it was really bringing down morale. So after a while of that, they began building the death camps in 1942. These are the train tracks, of course, leading into Auschwitz. Um, at the height of World War II, up to 12,000 people a day were being killed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz and other uh, death camps scattered around Europe, Dachau, Birkenau, and eventually, well, we don't even know how many people died. I've seen anywhere from 6 to 10 million victims of the Holocaust in Europe. Okay. Europe, of course, was not the only place that war had broken out. Japan was still being very aggressive in the Pacific. And even though on paper Japan and Germany and Italy are allies, it's really two separate wars. We have the war in Europe and we have the war in the Pacific. Beyond being allies, kind of in on paper, they were allies in name only. So we have Japan acting very aggressive in the Pacific. Again, they had been expanding into Manchuria since at least the 1930s. But as we get closer to the 40s, they began threatening what was then known as the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. And the United States did not approve of this. We said, Japan, you're acting very aggressively. We don't like this, and we're going to cut you off. We're not going to sell you anything that you can use to wage war. So we're not going to sell you, certainly we're not going to sell you guns, but we're not even going to sell you the materials you need to wage war. So we're not going to sell you oil or gas. We're not going to sell you sheet metal so you can make new airplanes, right? We're not going to sell you anything you need to continue these aggressive actions. Well, Japan saw this, the cutting off of sales, as an act of aggression by the United States. And so they felt that war with the United States was coming. They felt that war with the United States could not be avoided. And so they decided to make the first move. And of course, this is the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a base in Hawaii where the Pacific Fleet of the United States was stationed. And really, that was the only thing standing in the way of the Japanese. And so the Japanese knew if they could knock out the Pacific Fleet of the United States, there would be no one left to stand up against them. And so on December 7th, 1941, as FDR termed it, a date which will live in infamy, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. From the Japanese point of view, it was almost a complete success. Over 2,400 Americans killed, 300 aircraft destroyed or damaged, 7 ships were sunk, another 18 ships suffered massive damage. This, of course, iconic photo of the USS Arizona sinking. minimal losses for the Japanese. It caught the Americans completely by surprise. We were absolutely caught flat-footed, and our power in the Pacific was severely weakened. The only upside for the Americans, the backbone of the Pacific Fleet, our aircraft carriers, were scheduled to be in port on that day, and they were actually out to sea, so they were spared. So the most powerful ships of the Pacific Fleet actually escaped damage, but the rest of it, it was almost a complete victory for the Japanese. And without anyone to stand in the way of them, they are just going to roll through the Pacific. No one is able to stand up to them and to stop them. Now, the Japanese, they are going to create it's kind of funny. They're going to couch their attacks and claim we're doing you a favor. As they begin, they go into Vietnam, they go into Korea, they go into eventually the Dutch East Indies, they go into the Philippines. They say, listen, what we're doing, we are freeing you guys from these Western imperialists who have colonized you and taken you guys over. We're doing you guys a favor. We are freeing you from those Western colonizers. And really, what they were doing, they were creating their own empire. And so they weren't exactly beloved. No one regarded the Japanese as, liberators from these Western powers because they were pretty brutal in their methods. Okay, but now the United States is fully in the war. It's kind of like World War I. For a long time, the United States have been sitting by saying, this is not our conflict. This is a European conflict, or this is an Asian conflict. Doesn't have anything to do with us. We're going to stay out of it. But now we are late to the party, but we are here. So at this point, the Allies are comprised of Great Britain, which is still hanging on, the United States, and the Soviets. And so, war makes for strange bedfellows, right? The British and the United States, we have a shared history, we have a shared culture, we have long been allies of one another. That made sense. The Soviets was a completely different story. No one trusted Stalin, no one liked the Soviets. The United States, we really don't want to work with him, but everybody hates Hitler, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the thing about the United States, and I'm sure I'll ask you about this on the test later, the real strength of the United States in World War II, we didn't necessarily have the biggest army, we didn't have the fastest planes or the best tanks or the best guns. Our main strength in World War II is manufacturing. By the time we get to 1941, 42, everyone else is exhausted. They've been fighting this war for months or years. And again, like World War I, the United States is late to the party, and we arrive, kind of fresh. And with the exception of Hawaii, we haven't had the physical destruction that these other countries had had. So we may not have the best tanks and planes and guns, but when we can build, 5 or 10 tanks to your one tank, that is a huge advantage. And so that is America's greatest strength in World War II, is our manufacturing capacity. Now, all the Allies agreed that we were going to focus on Europe first. And rather than launch a full-scale invasion, a direct invasion of Europe, we were going to kind of nibble around the edges a little bit. So it all starts in the Soviet Union. In 1942, Stalin is finally able to drive Hitler out. In 1943, the Allies are going to focus on Northern Africa. They're going to defeat maybe one of the greatest military strategists to have ever lived, General Erwin Rommel, who was also known as the Desert Fox. Rommel was a professional soldier. I really think he was an honorable individual. I mean, he was a Nazi, but he refused to execute prisoners of war. He refused to execute Jews. And in fact, he was later caught up in a plot to remove Hitler from power and kill. As the war goes on, people really begin to question Hitler, and a lot of his military leaders plotted against him. And Rommel was one of those leaders who was plotting against Hitler. Eventually, he was found out and he died for it. But anyway, okay, 1943, the Allies retake North Africa, and they're ready to finally launch this invasion of Europe. And so they decide they're going to invade at Sicily, which is just off the, if Italy is a boot, it's kicking the island of Sicily, right? So that was the first the first target for invasion, and it fails miserably. The Germans were ready for the Allies. They were able to secure Italy. They threw the Allies back, and so we went back to the drawing board. About a year and a half later, um, we launch our second invasion of Europe, and of course, this one stuck. June 1944, the Allies land at Normandy, so-called D-Day, and really the thing that allowed for this to happen was air power. By the last days of the war, the German Air Force was just decimated. The Americans controlled the skies, and so they just launched bombing run after bombing run after bombing run to soften up Europe. Tens of thousands, I've seen estimates, hundreds of thousands of people died in these bombing runs that the Allies launched. And once we landed there was nobody else to stop us. So D-Day, we land in Normandy, we invade northern France, and from that point it really becomes a race. You've got the British and the Americans, and eventually I suppose the French pushing in from the west. You've got the Soviets pushing in from the east, and it becomes a race who's going to get to Berlin first. It's actually going to be the Soviets. But in 1945, the Soviet and American forces meet in Berlin. That spring, March 1945, and VE Day is celebrated May 8th, 1945. That stands for Victory in Europe. Germany finally surrenders. Hitler, of course, does not see the end of the war. Once it became obvious that he was going to lose, he commits suicide, uh, and that is one of the things that led Germany ultimately to surrender. And there was much rejoicing. All over the world, people were happy that this very long, incredibly deadly, incredibly destructive war in Europe was finally over. But we're still fighting in the Pacific. Remember, it's really two different wars. So the war is still going on in the Pacific theater. And the Americans are going to use a strategy known as island hopping. And so you can see here the Pacific Rim, as it's known, is comprised of all these archipelagos, these island chains. And so the idea was take over an island, use that as a staging point, leapfrog to the next island, completely take it over, use it as a staging point, and then just work your way around up through New Guinea, up through the Dutch East Indies, through the Philippines, and until finally you're ready to launch an attack on Japan itself. This is incredibly bloody fighting. These are small islands. These aren't these huge tank battles like we see maybe in Western Europe. These are relatively small, primitive islands. The Japanese had heavily fortified these islands. They had built tunnels and traps, and this was mainly hand-to-hand type fighting, just incredibly brutal, incredibly bloody. The Japanese culturally had a different view of warfare than the Americans did. The Japanese saw it as a great shame to surrender, and so a Japanese soldier, more often than not, would be willing to fight to the death, whereas maybe a soldier from a Western culture would have been willing to surrender. And so it was just incredibly bloody fighting. The turning point in the Pacific theater comes in 1942 with the Battle of Midway. Also around that time was the Battle of Coral Sea. This was finally the Americans had gone off the defensive, and now they've moved onto the offense. And by 1945, the United States is ready to invade Japan herself. And we're very hesitant to invade Japan. we think it might cause up to 1 million American casualties and maybe somewhere in the tens of millions casualties for Japan. The problem was, like I said, that the Japanese simply were not willing to surrender. They have almost no ships, no planes. Uh, they don't have the means to outfit their soldiers. We have firebombed Tokyo, killing 80,000 people, and still they refused to surrender. And so the Americans are afraid that if we have to invade Japan itself, then every man, woman, and child is going to fight the Americans, and we're just going to see enormous loss of life on both sides, and they don't want that to happen. And so they're searching for a way to end this war peacefully and relatively not in the war peacefully, but at least relatively quickly. And so that's where the atomic bomb comes in. Atomic power was something that was new. It's something that had been researched. We spoke about this, right, when we spoke about the years after World War One. Everyone was researching an atomic bomb. The Germans were trying to build an atomic bomb, and that's a scary thought. Well, what if Hitler had gotten his hands on an atomic bomb? But of course he didn't. The Americans finally are successful in creating one, and by 1945 we were ready to deploy it. And so the question is, are we actually going to use it? At this time, the American president, his name was Harry S. Truman. He had been FDR's vice president. FDR, of course, the American president that led us through the Great Depression, that led us through the opening days of World War II. And now here's this new guy who I can just imagine, it's like his first day on the job, and somebody calls him into the room and says, hey, by the way, we've been working on this ultra secret project, the most destructive bomb in the course of human history. What do you want to do with it, right? And so Truman has a choice to make, and he says, yeah, I can see the logic of this. He says, listen, we drop the atomic bomb, maybe it convinces Japan to surrender, and we're going to save millions of lives. Yes, we're going to kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but the flip side of that is we're going to save millions of lives. And that's the justification that he gave. I dropped the atomic bomb to end the war quickly and to save as many lives as possible. And that's certainly a possibility. There were a lot of people, though, who thought that maybe he had ulterior motives for dropping the bomb. A lot of people think that Truman dropped the bomb, and maybe it was a combination of both. But one of the reasons that he might have dropped the bomb was to scare the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, we could kind of see that things were not going so great with the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union and the Americans were going to have kind of a rocky relationship. And so maybe he was, this was a warning shot to the Soviet Union. Don't mess with us because this could happen to you too. So who knows? Who knows what was in his mind when he gave the order, but he did give the order. Of course, the United States, we are the only country that have ever used atomic bombs against people. We're the only country that's ever dropped atomic bombs in anger. On August 6th, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. 80,000 people died in the initial blast. Of course, who knows how many tens of thousands died later on due to things like radiation poisoning. 2 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. 100,000 people died in that initial blast. And after that, Japan finally surrendered, which was, I suppose, good for the United States. Those were the only two atomic bombs we had. It would have been months, I think, before we had had another one ready to go. This is a reconnaissance photo. I want to say that this is Hiroshima. Before bombing runs, airplanes would fly over cities to find strategic targets, right? Well, here's a factory where they build airplanes, and here's railroads where they move materials, and they use it to mark targets. Well, this was a photo taken before the atomic bomb, and this is one that is taken after the atomic bomb. Just complete devastation. If you were at ground zero, just complete devastation. I did read a story once about a civilian who was working at Hiroshima at the time the bomb was dropped. I want to say he was some kind of maintenance person. He worked in a maintenance job. And so when the bomb was dropped, he was actually underground. He was working at a large hospital and he was working in one of the sub basements. And so he was underground at the time the bomb was dropped. And so he survived the initial blast. And so you can just imagine he's working underground and there's this huge explosion and he comes up and he sees just complete devastation. And, nobody knew what was going on. They didn't know what an atomic bomb was. So he had to leave, right? He couldn't live in the city. He had to go somewhere else. So he decided to go stay at some relatives he had who happened to live in Nagasaki. And so he was actually in Nagasaki when the second bomb was dropped. But he survived that one as well. And so he was either incredibly unlucky or incredibly lucky, I suppose, depending upon your point of view. But like I say, just incredible devastation. All right, let's talk about some of these social aspects of World War II. Again, this idea, total war, battles, war wasn't something that just happened in a far off battlefield that soldiers fought and then a couple of days later you read about it in the newspaper, right? These are battles being fought in people's backyards. They're being fought in the cities where people live. More than any other conflict up to that point, civilians were targets during World War II. Estimates up to 49 million civilian deaths. Civilians truly were on the front lines of the war. If you were conquered by an enemy, different people did different things. Either they took direct control of you, or like in the case of France, when the Germans conquered France, they established what was known as a puppet government. They claimed to be free and independent, the so-called Vichy government, that's Vichy, the Vichy government. They claimed to be a true legitimate government of France, but the reality was they were a puppet government that did whatever the Germans wanted them to. Race played a role in how you were treated. For example, when the Germans conquered Denmark, they thought that the Danes were very culturally similar to the Germans, and so they allowed the Danes to pretty much continue on life as normal and kind of do their own thing. As the Germans moved into, say, Eastern Europe, that was not the case, and they were much stricter. Native populations and resources were exploited for war efforts. Millions of people, especially in Eastern Europe and Asia, were used as slave labor during World War II. Jewish people, of course, were also used as slave labor during the Holocaust. There were underground resistance movements. Maybe most famous, General Charles de Gaulle became famous for leading the Free French. He will, of course, become president of the restored French Republic. And we've talked about some of the atrocities of the Axis powers of the Germans and the Italians. But I also want you to know that there were atrocities on the side of the Allies as well. The Allies are not blameless. The Soviets mass murdered tens of thousands of German prisoners of war. Of course, here in the United States, our treatment of Asian Americans, thousands of Asian Americans were rounded up and placed in military camps because Americans did not trust them. They lost. Now, to be fair, these internment camps, they were not, the concentration camps like we saw in Germany during the Holocaust. Certainly nothing on that scale, but still, people lost their freedom, they lost their property, and for months and years, simply because they were perceived that maybe they weren't going to be loyal to the American. And these were American citizens. These are not Japanese nationals living in the United States. These are American citizens who have been stripped of their rights without due process. Racial propaganda against Asians is incredibly prevalent during World War II. You see here just ugly racial stereotypes being used against people of Asian descent. And these are not These are not, sort of fringe activities. This one on the far left is sponsored by Texaco. The one in the middle is sponsored by the Douglas Aircraft Company, which was a major U.S. aircraft company during those years. And then the one on the far right is sponsored by the U.S. Army, the U.S. Armed Forces. So, I mean, these are not fringe groups that are, these are mainstream American companies. And nobody says anything. There are no mass protests in the streets. There are no mass demonstrations at the injustices being delivered on Asian Americans. Everyone pretty much accepts it and goes about their day. So yes, there are atrocities on both sides. Like most wars, World War II did serve as an opportunity for minorities. As white men were called up for war, it allowed racial minorities and other marginalized group women to step into these leadership roles in business or in society. Post World War II, again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but now that Hitler's out of the picture, we're going to see that really even before the war is over, these allies are not necessarily going to get along, and we're setting the stage for this really epic struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. And we're going to talk much more about the Cold War in the next chapter. This is not what's known as a hot war, it's known as a Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States never actually go to war. We never invade the Soviet Union, they never drop bombs on us. It's a war of influence to see what would happen if we ever do actually go to a hot war. Now, it will become hot in other places, but this struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States is a Cold War. All right, I do want you to know about the Tehran Conference. This is in 1943. It's the first meeting of the so-called Big Three. That is, starting at the left, Stalin of the Soviet Union, FDR of the United States, and of course Winston Churchill of Great Britain. So I want you to know Tehran was the first meeting of the Big Three, and they talked about their strategy going forward. 1945, they met at Yalta. And we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But there were questions about Poland. Remember, in the early days, Poland had been split between Germany and the Soviet Union. And so the question was, is the Soviet Union going to give Poland back? There was the question about what to do about Germany. Germany has now been blamed for 2 world wars. Are we going to allow Germany to continue as is? What are we going to do about Germany? And the creation of the United Nations. That's the one I really want you to remember about Yalta. That is where the United Nations is created. The United Nations is the successor organization to the League of Nations with pretty much the same goal. It's an international organization designed to prevent another global conflict. The League of Nations failed horribly. Hopefully, the League of Nations will be a bit more effective. The League of Nations actually has 2 things going for it. Number one, the United States finally joins this time. And in fact, we will be a leading member of the United Nations. And number 2, now it finally has teeth. Now, if aggressive war is being offered or being conducted, the United Nations might be able to do something about it. All right, and then the last conference I want you to know about is Potsdam. And the problem with Potsdam is by this point, FDR has died in office, and now President Truman comes in and he says, all right, I'm going to get tough with the Soviet Union. I'm going to tell them they've got to stop messing around. And we'll talk about what's going on in the next slide. But Truman's going to get tough with Stalin and tell him, what's going to happen. And he doesn't. It's a failure. Truman has no leverage whatsoever. He was new. He really didn't know what was going on, and he is unable to stop the Soviet Union. What was happening was the Soviet Union was, as they were putting it, exporting communism. And we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But as they, said that it was a race between the Americans and British and the Soviets, right? The Americans and the British were moving in from the west, the Soviets were moving in from the east, and they're both trying to get to Germany. Well, as the Soviet Union was moving through Eastern Europe on their way to Germany, they were leaving behind little pockets of influence. They were leaving behind little pockets of soldiers. They were leaving behind communist propaganda. And so after World War II is over, we will see a wave of revolutions sweep through Eastern Europe. And country after country after country is going to have a socialist revolution, a communist revolution, and join USSR. They were, as they put it, exporting communism. And this makes the United States incredibly nervous. And they say, you know, what are we going to do? How are we going to stop the Soviet Union from expanding? How are we going to stop these revolutions from happening? And we come up with a couple of different ideas. We'll talk about them more in the next chapter. It's known as the Truman Doctrine and containment. We'll talk about the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. But what I really want you to know is that by 1949, the battle lines, so to speak, are going to be drawn. The United States is going to create a new military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is designed to prevent military aggression from the Soviet Union, and their military alliance, which is known as the Warsaw Pact. So we have the military alliances that lead us into World War I. We have World War I, which follows as a direct, or excuse me, World War II, which follows as a direct result of World War I. And then even, you know, here we are less than 10 years after the end of World War II, we have already redivided ourselves into yet more military alliances and yet another conflict to fight. And so even before the dust is settled on World War II, we're going to launch into what in some ways is an even larger conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. But we will talk about that in the next chapter.